Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks very much to MacGill and Joe in particular for the invitation to come back again this year. So I suppose the overall purpose of our session tonight is to try to assess Brexit, look at what will happen and what must change. I suppose if you're going to ask the question what will happen from an economic perspective, the true answer should be very short. We don't know. Like I have a simple rule when it comes to economic forecasts, they're all incorrect. By pure luck alone, somebody would be right. But when it comes to Brexit, we simply don't know what the outcome will be, simply because we don't know what way it will play out, what will be the parameters of the UK exit from the European Union, what will be the trade restrictions that will inevitably be imposed. From an Irish perspective, there will be losses, and equally, well, perhaps not equally, but there also will be gains. Some sectors will lose, perhaps given our dependency of food exports to the UK, it's likely that the most focused losses could potentially be in the food sector. That if we lose access to the UK market, even if we don't lose access to the UK market, if the UK market opens up to much lower cost competitors who can price out the Irish produce, it's likely that Irish food supplies into the UK would come under pressure. So replacement markets must be found and perhaps wouldn't be as lucrative. So when it comes to maybe gauging potential losses, the food sector is one where they could be most focused. But I think across the broader economy, the impact of Brexit will be difficult to ascertain. Unless you're trading and involved directly with it, it can be quite difficult to know what direct impact it's having on you. Like, we do expect the Irish economy to continue to grow, maybe growth rates of 3, 4, 5% a year. If we take an average of 4% a year, the impact of Brexit could be to reduce that to 3%. So the Irish economy is still improving. There still is an increase in employment, there still is an increase in earning, but rather than being 4% across the economy, it's been 3%. And it's perhaps that the impact could be quite focused. Where the gains could be is probably a bit difficult to determine. Maybe we'd be able to attract additional investment. There's talk of the banking and financial sector, but it really is hard to know. And maybe when it comes to the US multinational investment, I think at the moment the UK would be under a cloud of uncertainty when it comes to US investment. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, well, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, on his way out the door indicated that he was willing to cut the UK corporation tax to 12.5%. Well, his exact quote was below 15%, but we can take it he meant 12.5%. But of course, 10 days later he was gone. So US companies looking into the UK certainly don't know what the rate will be. So there is an air of uncertainty about what will happen. From an Irish perspective, I think it's important, first of all, to look and see, well, where are we? Where is the Irish economy? Where do we stand now? If we are faced with this uncertainty and this perhaps dip in Irish economic performance, we must first know where we are now. Marie mentioned the concept of the Irish economy overheating. Is that an absurd question? Is the Irish economy overheating? Well, I suppose during the week when it came to measuring economic figures and looking at economic data, we had certain difficulties. Like, determining where the Irish economy is hugely important. Whether it's from a fiscal assessment perspective, which is one of the roles of the Fiscal Council. I don't have my Fiscal Council hat on tonight. I'm tonight speaking as an academic from UCC, but the Fiscal Council has to assess the fiscal stance of the government. But to do that, you must know where the economy is. When it goes about assessing our competitiveness, well, where do we stand relative to our rivals? And when it comes about assessing the risks that the economy faces, well, the most straightforward question is, where are we now? Back in March, we thought the Irish economy was growing in 2015 at 8%. Provisional figures for 2015 said the growth rate was 8%. That was in March for a year that had finished 3 months previously. Last week, in the 7th month of the year, we revised the growth rate for 2015 from 8% to 26%. So if somebody going to forecast the Irish economy, we can't even know what happened last year. Never mind what's happening now, and then forecast that into the future. So determining where the economy is quite difficult. One of the issues that the Fiscal Council looks at, and Marie's mentioned it, is this whole idea of potential GDP. Where are we relative to our potential? And of course, one issue with this is that potential is by and large unknowable. Could you run a mile in 6 minutes? Probably not sitting down here now. But give it 6 months of training, 12 months of training. Could you run a mile in 6 minutes? Possibly. What is the potential of the Irish economy? Well, if we had more investment, more training, more investment, or more education, maybe our potential would be higher. So we had a massive increase in investment last year, and our GDP rose. But the potential is still unknowable. And the second element, it's potential GDP. it now appears that the GDP element is unmeasurable. The numbers are bouncing around so much. So in terms of assessing where the Irish economy is now, we're faced with a huge problem. We have an unknowable concept of potential and the unmeasurable concept of GDP. So when we ask the question, is the Irish economy overheating? Well, where do we look? We can't just throw our hands at it and say, well, we don't know. We do have different measures. The national accounts, GDP, GNP, etc., all that economic lingo are just one set. We can look more at the household level, and perhaps the best indicator we can get is employment and unemployment. And if you look at the unemployment rate in Ireland at the moment, it's 7.8%. That suggests there is spare capacity in the Irish economy. We can get our time for the mile down. We have more people we can put back to work, but not a huge amount. If the rate of improvement continues as it has, we'll probably drop below 6% before the end of next year. And then we're getting towards the realm of full employment. We're getting towards our potential, or perhaps getting towards the stage where the economy may begin to overheat. And if we look at good work the CSO has done, in terms of getting preliminary essential results out to us so quickly, that we had the census there in April, and then last week we got the head count and the house count for the country. If we just look at the head count, the population in the last 5 years has grown by 200,000. The impact of migration over the last 5 years is now estimated to be minus 28,000. That's for the entire 5 years. Outward net migration averaged around 6,000 a year for the last 5 years. So the impact of migration and bringing that unemployment rate down has been hugely overstated. The Irish population has grown by 200,000. And if we look at the overall figures, it's now likely that again by the end of next year, not only will our unemployment rate drop to below 6%, but employment will get back to the 2.1 million peak of 2007. And that's all in the next 15 to 18 months. If we were back in 2007, would we be saying to the government to throw more fuel on the fire? We've 2.1 million at work, but let's do a bit more. Let's cut more taxes. Let's increase more spending. Let's not aim for a 6-minute mile, let's aim for a 5-minute mile. As we know, if you set your targets too high and start running too fast, maybe there's a potential for a heart attack. And if we look at what happened back in 2007, 2008, in December 2007, budget for 2008 was introduced. It was a budget that had a package of 3 billion. Now, it's a much different 3 billion to what we're used to over the last couple of years. It was 3 billion of tax cuts and expenditure increases. In December 2007, 6 months later, the economy had virtually gone over a cliff. And those tax cuts and expenditure increases were very difficult to reverse, even though they'd just been introduced. You cut somebody's tax, increase their pay, increase social welfare. You go to cut that, no matter how quickly, it is quite a difficult process. And a 3 billion budget isn't that unusual. Last October we had a 3 billion budget. Mightn't have sounded like it, but if we take the 1.5 billion of supplemental spending that was announced the Friday before the budget, and the 1.5 billion of tax cuts and expenditure increases that we got on budget day itself, that totals 3 billion. So where is the Irish economy going? Are those tax cuts and expenditure increases sustainable? Is introducing a 3 billion budget simply giving us an echo of the policy mistakes in the past? And even this year, we had the revised estimates. We have lots of words for how the government calculate their expenditure. So we have the estimates, we have supplemental estimates, and this year, because of the delay in forming the government, we had revised estimates, where back in June an extra £500 million, 500 million of spending was allocated to health. The issue being that this had been known for some time. On the first occasion, the Department of Public Expenditure publicly acknowledged that there would be additional spending or spending pressures in the lingo for health was in March. But if spending pressures were known in March, were they known about last October? The issue is not that additional spending on health is bad. In fact, it could be hugely argued that additional spending on health is good. Reducing illness, saving lives, adding years to people's lives are all beneficial. But if the spending pressures are known, they should be planned for. If we knew the additional spending was required in October, we could have done it in October. Additional spending was announced in other areas. There was tax cuts that were introduced. If we have priorities, we should be planning. What has happened over the last while is that we've had increase in expenditure on the basis of an unexpected surge in revenue. That what happened in October with the £1.5 billion supplemental estimate, and by and large with the £500 million extra spending for health this year, although there are some complexities in the fiscal rules, by and large it was facilitated by a surge in tax revenue, money that the Minister had and he spent it. And this is the echo of the past. And again, I think it's probably worth pointing out that, from my perspective, that additional spending isn't bad, but it should be done in a sustainable fashion. Again, as Marie pointed out, it should be sort of in our memories, sort of the recent experiences, the impact that having a poor fiscal framework can have. That if we are going to change things, it should be done in a sustainable fashion. I'll come back to this surge in corporation tax revenue and try to assess whether it is sustainable. But by and large, as the money has come in, it has been used. I just want to look at one sort of issue that got a brief airing there, one that was discussed in a bit more detail today, was the whole issue of capital expenditure, and in particular the issue of housing expenditure, public expenditure on housing. Now, I'm not going to assess the efficacy, the efficiency, the rightnessness of additional spending here, but if we just look at it from a fiscal perspective, is there something preventing us from spending that additional money? So throughout the debate there have been frequent references to our fiscal rules are holding us back. And they are our fiscal rules. You hear them mentioned as EU's fiscal rules, but they're ours. There's an EU element, but equally there's a domestic element. But there's nothing in the fiscal rules that prevents spending on housing. There's nothing in the fiscal rules that prevents spending on capital infrastructure. What the fiscal rules look at is the spending being undertaken in a sustainable fashion? If we wanted to increase spending on housing, there are various different options you can go about doing it. We had £1.5 billion of extra spending in the supplemental estimates last October. We had £500 million of extra spending this year. If we want to spend additional funds, we could raise additional taxes. To date, in terms of housing, we've chosen to do none of those. And they are open to us. It's not the Minister for Public Expenditure Informed or the Minister for Finance. They are responding to what we want. And to date, we haven't spent that money. We could allocate money from different areas across to there, or we could raise additional taxes. In Ireland, raising taxes, particularly new taxes, seems incredibly difficult. Yet we all want the services. And the issue with the fiscal rules is that, can it be done in a sustainable fashion? There's no real distinction between current and capital spending from the point of view of the fiscal rules. We might think from the idea of a household that capital spending is irregular or lumpy. Like, we buy a house, we only do it once, and it's a massive jump in our expenditure. You could consider capital expenditure to be a bit like that for a government. But capital spending for a government isn't irregular. It's continual. They're always building schools, roads, hospitals, improvements in water infrastructure, improvements in housing. It's on an ongoing basis. It's not once off. It's repeated. And if you look at the fiscal rules, in fact, the only flexibilities are for capital spending. They do treat them slightly differently, in that if you increase capital spending, the increase is spread out over 4 years. That if we wanted to increase spending, the area where there is flexibility is in relation to capital spending. If expenditure was once off, if in any given year you had a once-off item, if that item was classified as capital, you could spend 4 times more than if that item was classified as current. Simply because within the rules, the increase is spread out over 4 years for capital spending. So it's not that the rules disallow or prevent increases in capital spending. By and large, it's that we choose to do so. Of course, the issue is capital spending isn't once off. If we're going to increase it this year, we want to maintain it and increase it the year after. So there isn't huge flexibility there, but there is some. So we should consider current and capital spending to be all coming from the same pot. Government spends 55, 56 billion euro, while the Exchequer spends 55, 56 billion euro a year. Of that, public capital investment is about 4 billion. At the peak, it was close to 10 billion. So it has dropped hugely. Now, you could say that they are different, and clearly they are different. There's a difference between public sector pay, social welfare transfers, and capital spending. Like, yes, there's a current and ongoing basis for public sector pay and social welfare transfers, but equally there's an ongoing basis for capital expenditure. We want it all the time. It's not a once-off. But capital spending is different. Again, as Marie has mentioned, it improves our potential sort of long-run output. It improves the economic capability of the economy. If we're building infrastructure, investing in roads, investing in broadband, even investing in education in terms of buildings, health, all improve the productive capacity of the economy. So capital spending is different. And if you don't invest in it, you can be harming the productive capacity of the economy. And in the midst of the crisis, that's potentially what happened. But our capital stock now, our public capital stock, is now insufficient to meet the needs of our growing economy. And as the CSO census results have shown, our growing population. If we take some work that an economist in the Fiscal Council has done, looking at capital spending, so Andrew Kennedy sort of ploughed through the figures and said that over the last 5 years we've been spending about $4 billion per annum on public capital spending. Again, compared to a peak of $9–10 billion back in 2007, 2008. Now that was a short-lived peak. That rose up dramatically in line with the unsustainable tax revenues of the time. But when looking at the public capital spending, Andrew has found that the depreciation of the existing capital stock is also in or around $4 billion. So whatever money we're pumping in for new capital is barely covering the loss of value and the effectiveness of the existing capital. And now, 4 or 5 years later of that, we're perhaps beginning to see the effects. What should happen now is this fellow should stand up here and tell you, what should the right level of public capital spending be? Well, the answer is we simply don't know. But if you look across an EU perspective, the average is about 4% of GDP. That's what most EU countries are spending on their public capital stock. The problem for us is, well, what are we going to measure it against? 4% of Irish GDP has suddenly become a lot of money. And is that our money? Even if you put it in GNP terms and make some reasonable assumptions, it's likely that our public capital investment is about half the average EU level. So why did that come about? Well, it came about because it went from $9–10 billion in 2007, 2008 to $4 billion now. Why did that happen? Well, again, it's down to us, because it was easier to do. Cutting capital investment when you're reducing expenditure is far easier than cutting current expenditure. If you cut public sector pay, you cut social welfare transfers, the victims of that know straight away. They will mobilise, they will organise, and they will object to those reductions. With capital spending, all you simply have to do is let the projects that are out there complete and don't start new ones. Who are the victims then? If a road improvement scheme isn't undertaken, the motorist just sees the same road every day. Oh, they should get rid of this interchange, they should have this free flow here, but didn't know it was going to happen. If we don't know what construction company was going to get the contract, who didn't get a job? So the victims of cutting capital spending are unknown even to themselves. Yet, collectively, we can potentially suffer from what happened. So if we had a much larger level of capital spending, we would have greater flexibility. We could change the priorities. That if we were spending much more, we could cut back in certain areas and increase in others. Maybe we have enough motorways to Dublin. Maybe now we need houses in certain sectors. So that $8–9 billion, a lot of it was going to motorways. Now we could shift the money into housing. But the issue is that the money has come down. The quantum of capital spending has dropped. But there's nothing in the fiscal rules that prevents it from going up. The fiscal rules apply for Sweden as they do for Ireland. We're one of the lowest tax and spend to GDP countries in the EU. Sweden is one of the highest. They adhere to the same rules as us. If we want to increase it, it really is a matter of choice. And I want to kind of come back to a step to this surge in tax revenue and where it came from. And as we know, it was corporation tax, which rose by about 60% in 1 year alone. A massive step level up. It was $4.3 billion in 2014. I think it was up at 6.6 billion in 2015. 2.3 billion extra in 1 year. A huge sum of money to come in. And we're now seeing that the impact of this was huge on our national accounts. Why was extra corporation tax paid? Because companies made extra profits. Who makes the bulk of the company profits in Ireland? It's the foreign companies. Foreign companies account for 80% of the profits earned in Ireland, so they account for 80% of the corporation tax. If corporation tax surges, it must be down to something in the multinational sector. And clearly it was. Why did GDP surge? Well, we spoke about the public capital stock and how that improves the productive capacity of the economy. In 2015, Ireland's overall capital stock, this is what the government is pumping $4 billion a year into. Ireland's overall capital stock grew by $300 billion. So government spending is this much, but everybody else pumped in $300 billion of capital to Ireland. And a lot of it was movable assets, things that multinational companies own that they can move around. Intangibles, patents, R&D developments, things that up to recently they'd placed in Caribbean islands, and now they're placing it in Ireland. And they're placing huge sums of it. So the assets moved, 300 billion of them. And with that, of course, comes some of the profits. And last year, company profits in Ireland rose 23 billion. Corporation tax rose 2.3 billion. In rough terms, that's 10%. You declare extra profits in Ireland, you're going to play close enough to our 12.5% rate of corporation tax. So why do companies bring 300 billion worth of assets to Ireland? Why the profits increased by 2.3 billion? Was it something we did? The Irish corporation tax regime hasn't changed hugely in the last couple of years. We did introduce a knowledge development box that has a rate of 6.25%. So you might say they're coming for that. But that only applies to assets that are developed in Ireland. You find a patent, undertake some R&D, you can avail of the knowledge development box. But you must do it in Ireland. You do the R&D in America, or you're transferring an asset from the Cayman Islands, the knowledge development box isn't available to you. So why did companies transfer all the assets to Ireland? By and large, it was international developments. The impact of things like Brexit had a big impact on Ireland, and a major international development that has a big impact on Ireland is an OECD project on taxes. The OECD is a project called Base Erosion and Profit Shifting. They want to stop companies declaring their profits on white sandy beaches in the Caribbean. Let's have beautiful brown sand in Ireland instead, on sunny days like today. And that's what's happened. The OECD rules have changed, and now companies, instead of declaring their assets in no-tax jurisdictions, are declaring their assets in a low-tax jurisdiction. And we are a low-tax jurisdiction, and we're now benefiting massively from that. Our target was to benefit from jobs, and that has been hugely successful. The objective of the OECD's project has been to align profit with substance. Now, I think the target could have been that the substance is in France or the substance is in Germany, but a lot of the US companies had their substance in Ireland. 100,000 employees here already. So if they couldn't place the assets in the Caribbean, where were they going to go? They could go back to the US, where the assets came from originally. Tax rate of 35%. They could go to France or Germany, 25%. Possibly the UK intending to move to 12.5%, but we're not sure where they're going. Are they in and out of the European Union? They have chosen to come to Ireland. So we now maybe face an additional risk of not just the impact of Brexit maybe on our food sector, but the impact of the international tax environment on our revenues. And this surge in tax revenue has increased over the last 12 to 18 months, and by and large, a lot of it's been spent. Again, it's not bad to spend the money, but is it sustainable? Will it be here next year, the year after that? These are intangible assets, a patent. If you invent a medicine, how long are you going to make a profit for? The patent itself is for 17 years. So we know there's a definite end point when these patents will be worthless, when the value, the profits will drop to zero, and potentially the corporation tax we receive from them will fall. But companies register patents as soon as they find the compound. These things don't have 17 years left. After 7 or 8 years getting through the approvals process, there might only be 7 to 10 years left. And we don't know how long they've been in existence already. So there are certain risks with this surge. Yes, it's a positive for Ireland. 1, we had the substance here already. 2, we had the stability and the certainty. And 3, the companies were willing to put the assets here. And that is why we're benefiting. Yes, the GDP numbers are funny. But they are real in the sense that the assets did move here. They don't represent what happened on the ground in the Irish economy. To that, look at employment. Look at unemployment. But US multinationals moving assets here can only be good for us. If a couple of days of bad headlines about GDP growth brings in 2.3 billion of additional tax revenue. Well, sign me up. Paul Krugman can talk about leprechaun economics, but we're up 2.3 billion. That to me is a win. And it's now, I suppose, how we look and see what we do with that. Are we going to spend that money? Do we think the Irish economy is underperforming? If we think the Irish economy is underperforming, maybe spending that money is good. If we think the Irish economy is moving in the right direction, and there's this threat of Brexit in the future, well, maybe spending the money isn't the right thing. Maybe we should wait and delay, not looking to fix the problems that were caused by the last crisis, but looking ahead and making sure we're in a better position to deal with the next inevitable downturn, one that Brexit itself might cause. When it comes to the ongoing recovery in the Irish economy, there's this view out there, oh, that I'm not feeling it, that it's not a fair and equally distributed recovery. It's not supposed to be fair and equally distributed. The crash wasn't fair and equally distributed. Those who suffered most during the crash were those who lost their jobs. Their livelihoods were wiped out. Those who gained most in the recovery are those who get back into employment. Since it reached its trough, employment has grown by about 130,000. Might be revised up a bit. If 3/4 of those people were a couple in a household, you're talking about 220,000 people being directly affected by the recovery. There are 3.6 million Irish adults. You survey 100 people on the street, 6 of them will tell you they've benefited from the recovery. 220,000 is 6% of our adult population. They are the people who have benefited the most. You survey the rest of them, they'll say, I haven't felt it at all. Well, they're not supposed to feel it. What we want is people getting back into employment. Running an economy isn't like being a producer in the Late Late Show. It's not one for everyone in the audience. And we can't expect it to be. Looking for this recovery to be fair and evenly distributed is wrong. We want it to benefit as many people as possible, and getting people back to work is benefiting as many people as possible. Unsustainable tax cuts and expenditure increases aren't the way to go about it. We saw that in the run-up to 2008, and we should know that now. It was only 7 or 8 years ago. If we think the Irish economy is going in the right direction, we don't need one for everybody in the audience. We just need to keep things steady, know that there are risks out there, both quite close to us in terms of the UK, and equally a bit farther away from us in terms of the US. If the US tax regime changes, those assets might move again. So what we need to do is, yes, say things are going in the right direction. Perhaps the Irish economy is close to overheating, but let's make sure we're in a position to deal with the next downturn rather than worrying about fixing the last one. Thanks very much.